We are in Hebrews chapter 1, and last week we looked at the idea of how it is. Oh, by the way, did y'all see this? Anybody know? Hebrews it, right? Huh? It's funny, isn't it? Yeah, Hebrews it. All right. Bruce, I'm like hearing something back. I don't know if you can knock that down just a little bit. All right, thanks. Yeah, now, of course, the real joke here is that this is almost the exact same joke as last week with just a word difference, right? Last week was just the setup, so I could put this up here just for that reason. Okay, all that aside, now I can go ahead and erase this. We talked about how did God speak before in the Old Covenant and before? All right, he spoke to the fathers through the prophets, right? In many different forms, in many different ways, many different times. He spoke to Abraham in a certain way. He spoke to Moses in a certain way. Every time that there's some kind of a covenant, God is speaking in different ways, whether it be through visions, such as the patriarchs saw, whether it be face-to-face in some kind of way, like what you find with Moses, whether it be with a thus saith the Lord that you have, like the prophets might have. God spoke different things, but in these times, he speaks through whom? All right, he speaks through the Son. And I tried to get across last week that the important aspect of this is not the agency. It's not that he spoke through prophets back here, but now he speaks through his Son as the agent, and that's what's important, because he still speaks through prophets, right? Even in this covenant. He gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers, right? For the equipping of the saints, building up the body, all of that, Ephesians chapter 4. So it's not that the agency is different, it is the finality that is different. Last time he spoke to the fathers and all of that, the greatest that there was just the prophets. And the idea behind that is that there's always something more on the horizon. There's something more that's coming. The prophets were looking forward to something else, and then he sent his Son, and the Son is greater than any of those prophets. And so it's not just simply about agency, it's about status, is how this begins. The Son is greater than the prophets. The Son is also greater than whom? All right, he is greater than angels. I appreciated the service in the Psalms, looking at some of the Messianic Psalms and such this past Sunday. We hit on some of the ones that are actually quoted here in chapter 1. Now, if this were a 2 or 3 quarter class, we would spend time looking at every single one of these quotations, and then we would go back into the Old Testament, and we would look at every single one of these quotations, and then we would ask the challenging questions, such as, hey, who's the psalmist writing about? You know, when it says, in 2 Samuel chapter 7 there, let's see, where's that? I will be to him a father, he will be a son to me. Who is that talking about? Because when you go to 2 Samuel chapter 7, that sounds like it's talking about Solomon. Especially when the next phrase is, oh, and by the way, when he sins, then I'm going to reprimand him in certain ways, right? I'm going to use the whips, whips of men and things like that to reprove him. Does that sound like Jesus? When he sins? No, not at all, right? And you have to ask the tough questions, and you have to say, what's going on here? Is it right for the author of Hebrews to take 2 Samuel chapter 7, or Deuteronomy chapter 32, Psalm 104, Psalm 45, Psalm 102, just about the only one in here that is just absolute rock solid, take it to the bank quotation that you say, yes, this is talking about Jesus? Anybody know which one that is? It's in verse 13. Anybody know where that comes from? All right, Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is, at least in my estimation, as I'm standing right now, if you ask me in 10 years, maybe it might be different, but right now I think it's the only of the Messianic Psalms that is just clearly Messianic. And it's not anything else. It's not like, Psalm 22, which is about David and what David's going through and his circumstances, which then after the Messiah, you look back and you say, oh, boy, this applies to Jesus too, doesn't it? It's not that type of thing. From the beginning, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemy a footstool for your feet, right? Jesus uses that as an example of something clearly messianic. All the other ones, they're questionable. You have to wonder, are they just ripping things out of context and using them the way that they want to? And like I said, we don't have the time to really flow through all of this. Hopefully some of y'all might remember some of this discussion from our cottage classes, but that was a long time ago, right? Matthias, yeah, thank you. Yes, very good. When we talked about Matthias, we talked about how the early church was using the scriptures because Jesus did not tell them, replace Judas, right? It's not there. What prompted them to do this? Why did they say, oh no, we need someone else to do this? Jesus didn't leave that message with them. God did not come in a vision. There was no reason for them to do that except what? What's the only stated reason that Peter gives in Acts chapter 1? All right, because the Psalms say to do it. And then you go and you look at the Psalms that say to do it, and you're like, these don't say to do this. If I'm reading through this, and if I'm fair and if I'm honest, I don't know what Peter's reading here, because this does not have anything at all to do with Judas or the apostles. But it does if you're not reading like we do in our 21st century modern in post-enlightenment type of a mindset where everything's about a historical, grammatical context, but we're reading with a larger context. Kelly?
They could play that card. We could play that card for them because the apostles were going to be guided by the Holy Spirit into all completely understand.
Yes, what Kelly said is they obviously can, they're inspired by the Holy Spirit, and so we can clearly say, well, yes, they are inspired by the Holy Spirit. That's a card that's able to be played, but at the same time, that's not what they say. And it's important that we understand that. They don't say, listen to me because the Holy Spirit is guiding me to say this. They're just saying it. When they're writing it, they're simply writing it. Or Peter stands up and says, obviously the psalm says to do this, and he doesn't say the psalm says to do this, and the Holy Spirit has led me to understand it this way. He just says, this is what the psalm says. And it goes to, does anybody remember what we talked about way back when and why they could get away with that in their culture? The way that they looked at and understood the scriptures? All right. It has to do with, and again, we don't have the time to go through all of this. Has to do with the philosophy of thought behind the Jewish Midrash. And that's one of those writings that you have, not inspired. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that Midrashic writings, the Jewish writings, are inspired, but it's the thought process behind those Midrashic writings. These are the writings, that they're tied to looking at ways of understanding the writings of the Old Testament. And these are Jews who were doing this. The Christians took this mindset and they moved forward with it. Now, the midrashic type of understanding is to say, and this kind of goes to what Kelly was saying, how many authors are there really? All right, there's really one author to everything, right? And so every book in the Old Testament has one author, God, behind it. So if you see things up in Genesis or Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers, and then you find something over here, say something that plays out in the story of the Judges that is an awful lot like maybe a law that you find over here or a story from Genesis, and you have this inner contextuality that's playing through, and you begin to say, how did that happen? Maybe there's one author behind this, and it's not that these things sound similar. Maybe it's not a coincidence. Maybe it's supposed to be this way so that we draw from one to understand the other. And we start playing connect the dots with various things. Now, here's how this fits into understanding the New Testament and what the Hebrews author, and I think what Peter was doing as well. Let's say that you have your Old Testament scriptures, because remember, they didn't have New Testament scriptures, right? Especially in Acts chapter 1. It wasn't Acts chapter 1 yet. So as they're sitting in this upper room, they have their scriptures out, and they're saying, we have new revelation available to us now. We have a brand new, I guess you could say, overlay to put over these Old Testament scriptures. We have a brand new lens to start looking at this Old Testament. What is that lens? It's Jesus. It's his crucifixion, it's his resurrection, it's his teaching, it's everything about him. And they start saying, what back here in this Old Testament can now connect to something over here that is Jesus? Are there new dots that we can connect now that new revelation has been given to us? Does that make sense? So if you see maybe something about the Son of God in the Old Testament, what is Jesus called? The Son of God. And you say, those two dots, is it just a coincidence that you have this information about the Son of God back here, and then you have Jesus come onto the scene, who is the Son of God, in a way that Israel never really was, right? He is the true Son of God, fulfills it perfectly, and so you start drawing these connections. Thus, as you're reading through in Psalm chapter 2, and this is a coronation, at least as I understand it, some people disagree, but anyway, it's a coronation psalm. This is a psalm that would have been sung, when they were crowning the king. And as the king is sitting on his throne, everyone's saying, all those enemies out there, they're going to laugh, or they're going to think that they can do something against God's anointed. But can they? No, because he who sits in the heavens laughs at their attempts. They can't do anything about this. He's going to turn whatever they want to do against them, and it's going to hurt them because God is with his anointed. Is there a greater anointed of God's than Jesus? No. So whereas it had its purpose as one thing back here, you put the New Testament overlay or the New Covenant overlay, you put the Jesus overlay, and it has new meaning to it. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, when God comes to David, he sends his prophet, right? Nathan comes to David, and David says, hey, I want to build a temple. And after first saying, okay, then God says, no, go to him. And he says, you're not going to build my house, but I tell you what, David, I'm going to build your house, right? And he says, I'm going to build you up. And your son, I'm going to have a father-son relationship with him. He's going to be like a son to me, and I, a father to him. And I'm going to discipline him like a father does because I love him. And he's the one who's going to build your temple. And he's the one that's going to do all of this. And yeah, that's talking about Solomon, isn't it? But isn't it talking about Jesus? Isn't Jesus the Son of God with that father-son relationship in a much greater way? Did Jesus not build a greater temple than Solomon ever built? Right? And so you have, once again, you're finding these new connections. So that's what's happening. This is the real, just quick overview to get us through looking at all of these. But yeah, you read through these, and the way that we typically think about it, we go to the Old Testament, we read through these quotations, and if we're fair, a lot of them were like, that's not Jesus. That's talking about Yahweh. That's talking about a man. That's talking about someone else. This isn't a hint of Jesus, except for Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord. I mean, yeah, that one seems to clearly be, but the rest you kind of wonder about. But when you start thinking this way, putting these connect the dots and stuff, they make a whole lot more sense. Does everybody follow that okay? All right, I spoke a lot, so now I can leave it up. Anybody have questions? I may not be able to answer them, but do you have questions about that? Yeah, Dave.
Just a question about typology. I mean, things that happen in the Old Testament or figures in the Old Testament that, as you say, looking back now in light of Christ, you do see, what appears to be either a very strange coincidence or something that was pointing forward that wasn't known at the time of the events, or maybe when the events were written down or whatever. But there is a fairly striking and obvious connection. So you hear the term typology to refer to some of these things. Does that fit into what we're talking about here?
Oh, it absolutely does, yeah. Yeah, that is definitely a huge part of this idea of connecting these dots, like seeing Jesus in the Isaac, the binding of Isaac story. Are we allowed to do that? Because no one in the New Testament does that. There's nowhere in the New Testament that connects Jesus to Genesis chapter 22. So, are we then overstepping our boundary to go to Genesis chapter 22 and say, look, I see Jesus right here because of this, and this, and maybe some more. I wasn't counting how many thises I was doing. I don't think that's overstepping the boundary at all. I think that's seeing this typology, which is a biblical word. Paul uses that, in 1 Corinthians, but seeing this and making use of it. Kelly?
Maybe you said this and I missed it. So you made the point that some of the prophecy, some of these psalms, like one was talking about Solomon, but we can apply it to Jesus, like it kind of works in both ways. So that made me curious about this Psalm 110 that you said, like very clearly seems to be talking about Jesus, like the Lord said to my Lord. Like there doesn't seem to be like a current in David's life equivalent that you could draw to that. So how did he write this? Was that just like him prophet? Like I guess so that made me wonder what made him write this. Like did he have knowledge of Jesus?
All right, moving on. No, honestly, I have no idea.
Okay.
That is, for me, that's a conundrum because it's not something that's very specifically part of what he's doing. Yeah, thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that. I made the joke and I forgot I needed to repeat the question for people that didn't hear it, and they don't get the joke either. If you have all of these different psalms or different types or things that clearly have a meaning in their own day and their own time, except for Psalm 110, what prompts the writing of Psalm 110? Why does David sit down and write this? What does he see? What does he know? What does he understand? Is he given a glimpse into something to come that doesn't seem to be the case? Is that fair, Kelly? from? Yeah. And I couldn't tell you on that one exactly what prompts that. It's a really good question, though. All right. So let's now get to, now that we've talked about this and how to understand these, let's now get to understanding what's taking place. What's this comparison that's being made? In Hebrews chapter 1, starting verses 4 really through 14.
Angels and Jesus.
Okay, Jesus with the angels, right? So you have the angels on the one side, and Jesus over here. And what's the comparison? Okay, that Jesus is better than, because he what? Okay, yeah, verse 14, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. So it's tied to his name. And then all of these quotations, right? You are my son, today I've begotten you. I will be to him as a father. He will be to me as a son. Let all of God's angels worship him. He makes angels, winds, as ministers, a flame of fire, but of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of unrighteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You've loved righteousness, hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And you, Lord, laid the foundations of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like a garment, like a robe. You will roll them up like a garment. They will be changed, but you are the same. Your years will have no end. And finally, to which of the angels did he ever say, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? So what is the comparison then? Yes, Jesus is greater than the angels. But why does that matter? He has a greater what? All right, name, right? What's the name that he has inherited? All right, the Son. What are the angels? What's that? All right, messengers, sure, but I mean, like, what does he call them? Is that, am I? All right, ministering spirits. How about, I'm just going to use the word servants. Does that work okay? All right, they're ministering spirits. You know, they're ones who just simply go out and do what?
Ministerial activities.
All right, but why do they do them? They're told to. By whom? Who? What's that?
God?
Yeah, I mean, a higher authority, right, is the one who sends the servants out. God sends the servants out, and so they have to be obedient to a higher authority. What about the Son?
Has his own authority.
He does. He is the authority. Yeah, I mean, you know, keep in mind the way that they think in ruling aspects. It's not like, you know, we might think of it like, obviously in my house, you know, I have many sons that I put the smack down on all the time. You know, they're nothing compared to me. But that's not the way that in a in a kingship or whatever type of society, that's not the way that they would think of this. The Son is the Father in waiting. He's the King in waiting. He has all the same rights, everything else as the King, and he will be the King, and he holds that by inheritance. That's what he inherits. That's his. That's the power that he has. So the servants simply do the bidding of the one who rules. What does the Son do? He rules, right? That's the difference between these. Now, why does that matter? Why start in chapter 1 with this whole discussion about the angels?
Maybe the role of the angels in delivering the law of Moses or bringing certain things to pass in the Old Testament.
Okay, all right. So Dave just said perhaps the role of angels in delivering the law of Moses. Ryan, what were you going to say?
It matters because Jesus made the conscious choice to obey his Father, to take on the human body, to go through all that suffering, to be the sacrificial lamb. Jesus chose to do that, and that's why it matters.
All right, so inherent in being the Son is a choice that a servant does not have. Because there is specific authority that is held here. Kevin?
I guess my thought would also include the fact that there's a spiritual war that's in place, that there were angels who left the realm of God in rebellion. So it's a very point in the spiritual realm, there is still a king, if you will. There's still one in charge. There's still I don't know exactly how to say it. The heavenly realm is secure, and it has a leader, you'll say.
Okay.
And so there's this spiritual war that's out there that is part of what we deal with in this earthly realm too.
Okay, so what Kevin's talking about, he was mentioning this, there is an ongoing spiritual war that still wages, that has waged and was obviously still going there in the time of the New Testament because different writers allude to it, talk about it very specifically, mention it, and that still continues on with these spiritual, in the spiritual places. To that, I would simply say, it's not that I disagree with that, but the Hebrews author doesn't allude to that.
No, I'm not saying he does, I
Yeah.
guess specifically, but when you put that up there, there's a reason, it seems like, to establish that in heaven there is an order. There is a king at the right hand, where we see that with Jesus being brought to that position. There's order, there's control, there's
Yeah, absolutely. There's Kevin saying that as you look at this, it's clear. There is an established hierarchy. There's order that you find within the heavens. And that's what this is getting across. Is that the Son is at a higher place in this hierarchy than what the servants are. I want to go back to what Dave was saying just a second ago, because it seems as if that's the connection that the Hebrews author makes in chapter 2. He says, therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard. By the way, what have we heard? What's he saying there? What we have heard. What is that?
The gospel, Jesus.
Yes. Okay, Jesus. Tie it, though, to something he's already said in the letter. I don't know, maybe the first couple verses? Well, yeah, long ago, God spoke to them in some way.
Hear of all things.
Now God speaks to us in his Son, right? So the speaking to us, that which we have heard, that which has been given to us in this new covenant. So therefore we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Declared at first by the Lord, it was attested to us by those who heard, while God also bore witness by signs and wonders and various miracles and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. All right. So let's break this section down just a little bit right here, because this is kind of the crucial point of understanding the so what of this first comparison as far as the angels are concerned. Kelly?
Anita in the chat answered your so what question, said Jesus is the one who brings salvation, not the angels.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And I want to go with that, what Anita just said in the chat. Jesus is the one who brings us salvation, not the angels. What's the problem in Hebrews? What's the issue? What prompted the writing? All right, I need you guys to remumble that.
Going back to listen only to the prophets.
Okay,
Back to the Old Law.
people who are in the new covenant, who are leaving and going back, trying to find their justification, trying to find their salvation, trying to find their purpose here, right? That's the problem. That has to be what is lying underneath everything that we see as we read through Hebrews. And so as we let this problem play out, why does this matter then? That Jesus has a greater name than the angels. That Jesus holds authority, the authority of God himself. He holds the authority in and of himself, whereas the angels are simply servants. Why does that matter? Dave, what did you say just a second ago? What did the angels do?
Huh?
What did the angels do?
They had a role in delivering the law of Moses.
Yeah. They were the agency by which the law of Moses came to Moses. That's what's here. Paul also speaks of that in Galatians as well. Just making this clear point that the covenant that they're trying to go to in order to look for the place where they can have a proper and a right relationship with God, right? That's what they're wanting. The sacrifices that are involved, everything else, they're coming to here to find a proper and a right relationship with God, and yet, ultimately, who gave this? I mean, God gave it, but God gave it, what was the agency? He spoke through the angels. He sent servants for that one, right? What about this new covenant? Where's this new covenant come from? Comes from the Son. Now, if you were to get two different writings, and I'm trying my hardest not to get too far ahead and go into chapter 9 and talk about some of that discussion, which will be there eventually. But if you had something that came from, maybe the steward of the house, it's not really a good word because we're going to be using that next week. But if you had something that came from, a servant and said, hey, this is how you're supposed to do things, and you do that for a while, but then the Son comes to you and says, hey, this is the way we're doing things now, which one are you going to listen to? If it's different, which one are you going to listen to? The one with the most authority. Are you going to simply say, hey, thanks for that, son, master of the house, the one who holds all the authority? That sounds great, but you know what? I'm going to come over here because one of the servants came out and said to do it this way. Would you do that? No. Kevin?
Well, not to throw you too far off, but one of the parables of the messengers were sent, and they were beaten and sent back, and they sent his son and they killed him because they didn't want to hear the message.
Yep.
So, yeah, they knew that the message from the son was the stronger message than from any other message that would happen.
Absolutely. And the way that in the parable, the way they treat the son has a greater effect on the master than the way that they treated those previous servants, right? And that is going to come in chapter 10. The abuse against the son himself is a greater abuse than the abuse against the servants in that parable. And that will play out. Dale?
You mentioned Galatians. I was just going to mention what Paul said there when he said, we, or an angel from heaven.
they'll be cursed. So there's the gospel they have heard was from Jesus, the gospel of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Although I think he says even an angel, but you could, see a connection back here that, yeah, it was angels who delivered this and brought this, but this holds more authority.
The point being that Jesus is the ultimate authority.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Jesus is the ultimate authority. What Dale said just a second ago, there in Galatians 1, Paul says, if we or even an angel were to come to you and present to you a gospel that is different from the one that's from the Son that we proclaimed to you before, let that one be accursed. And yeah, very strong language. So this is the what here. I mean, this is the crux of it. If you get nothing else, understand why Jesus is greater than the angels, why that matters. It's because he has a greater agency. All right? I'm probably going to use that word a few times as we review, because we're going to, obviously review and stuff. He has a greater agency. That is the means by which he is the agent that provides the new covenant. So he has a greater agency than the angels who were simply servants. So as we continue through chapter 2, he talks about this idea, and by the way, there are clear indications, and maybe I should get this out of the way now. There are clear indications that the Hebrews author is using what translations? Anybody know?
Septuagint?
He's using what's called the Septuagint. What's the Septuagint?
Greek translation of the Hebrew Scripture.
Yeah, it's a Greek translation of the Old Testament. Usually, if you ever see this, that's a reference to the Septuagint, 70. Septuagint, it's, anyway. This was a translation of the Hebrew into Greek, and it was probably predominantly used by Christians in the first century. They probably used a translation of the Old Testament scriptures more than the Masoretic text, which wasn't necessarily the Masoretic text then, but the Hebrew text that we are familiar with. So, clear indications that this is what is being used. There was a quotation in chapter 1 that is in the Septuagint, but it's not in our text, and so it causes a lot of confusion if you were to try to go back in ours. And the way that you have the Psalm 8, you made him for a little while lower than the angels, whereas the Masoretic text seemed to indicate you made him a little lower than the angels, as in the word that's describing how little has to do with his place among the angels. Here, it has to do with the time reference. You made him for a little while, you made him lower than the angels, which indicates what? He was made a little lower, but then what? He's going to go up higher once again. And so he did this in order to put himself with us. Verse 10, for it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, that is his status way up here, to do what? What did he do? For it is fitting that he, verse 10, for whom and by whom all things exist, and what? I'm just asking you to read the next line. This one's not a hard one. To bring many sons to glory, which gives this impression, and we're going to talk about this quite a bit more, but it's as if Jesus came down here. Here's where the angels are, right? Jesus came a little lower than the angels to do what? To grab some of us and bring us to glory with him. And this is an important picture from Hebrews. There is a certain line, by the way, we cannot cross. We cannot cross this line. We cannot put ourselves into God's presence. It is an impossible thing to happen. but God can cross that line. And he did. He crossed it, and then he is going to cross it again, go back up into the presence of God, and things are going to be different on the flip side. Kevin?
So, what's your thoughts about this time frame of a little lower than the angels? Was that his time on earth? Was that his time when he was crucified on the cross and took on the sins of mankind?
Oh, I think, yes. His becoming a human. This is Philippians 2, which is, it's not just the death. It's not just the cross, but it's the one, he who had all the status that there possibly could be. But he didn't, even though he was equal to God, he didn't regard that as something to hold on to for himself. Instead, he humbled himself. And he even humbled himself to be a man, in the form of man, but then even more to be obedient to death on the cross. I mean, it's the same picture, right? Came down all the way so that then God what? Highly exalted him and gave him the name which is above every name. It's that same picture of coming down as far as you possibly could, which is his incarnation from the very beginning. It's the death. It's everything. But then going all the way up at the same time. And I'm going by this clock. I've got one more minute. So one thing to point out is that does God have any help involved for the angels? Verse 16. No, right? In other words, when they rebel and they sin, that's it. There's no hope. God does not provide hope for them. The only hope comes to the sons of Abraham. Who are the sons of Abraham? Those who are sons by what? By faith. I heard someone say that. All right, so then you have he had to become like his brothers in all ways so that he could serve as the proper high priest. And now we're introduced to that idea, which is going to be a constant motif throughout. Okay, any final questions? If it's too big, I can't answer it right now anyway. I don't have time, but anybody want to give me a softball? Put it on the tee for me? No? Okay. All right. Good class, guys. Appreciate it. And we're going to take a little bit of a break, and then we'll have our talk in just a second. Thanks.